Is there anything else I missed? Bring something else with me?
Welcome everyone. Thanks for coming here today. I'm Paul Scharre, Director of the Technology and National Security Program here at the Center for New American Security. I am very pleased today to announce the launch of a new report by the Honorable Richard Danzig talking about how we think about technology risk. Secretary Danzig has been a thought leader on emerging technologies for a long time, and I'm very excited that this new report will have a very valuable contribution to how we think about risk for emerging technologies in the national security space. We're in a very interesting time where a number of countries have stated their clear desire to move out aggressively in artificial intelligence, among other technologies. Last year, China released a new national strategy for artificial intelligence, and the United States has made it a centerpiece of its attempts to regain and reinvigorate U.S. military technological superiority. So we have a great lineup of speakers here today. I'm just going to briefly mention them. You've got their full bios in your handout there, but we have sitting next to Secretary Danzig, Jeff Alstott from IARPA, Dr. Valerie Browning from DARPA, and General James Cartwright, former Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So I'm sure we're going to have a great discussion, and I'm very excited that this report will contribute to what I hope will be a robust discussion within the national security space for how we think about risk as we pursue these new technologies. With that, I'll turn it over to Secretary Danzig. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you particularly not only for this event, but for your role in this production of this report and the Center for New American Security generally. I'm quite grateful for all the hard work and valuable contributions you all made. This report, I'll just briefly mention, stems from an observation about the centrality in our present thinking about the importance of maintaining technological superiority. It's probably the case that no single theme has been as dominant in recent time in national security discussion. And I think this is a consequence of a sort of normalization of the world. The present national security establishment really grew out of the World War II experience and the Cold War experience. And this was an experience in which the United States strongly dominated in technology innovation. We were advantaged at the end of World War II. We had this vast collection of scientists, many of them refugees from Europe. We had 50% of global GDP and an intact structure of industry and the like. And this led naturally to our dominance, but we nurtured it and sustained it and offset Soviet Union advantages in terms of manpower with our technology skills. Now we see, as I say, a more normal world, one in which technology is diffused much more substantially, in which China's economic capabilities begin to come towards equality with us. And notably, if you project, as some economists have, 2050, you might see a world in which the Chinese economic capability measured by GDP in dollars would be 50% greater than ours. So there are questions about our technology superiority. My report is not actually, though, about how we maintain that. Lots of people have written and spoken about that. The focus is on a different thing, which is that superiority is not synonymous with security, that the very race itself generates risks, and the proliferation of technologies particularly compounds those risks. So that what we see as we move forward is increasingly complex and opaque technologies, which we cannot really fully comprehend, being employed in military contexts where they're connected to highly destructive weapons, nuclear weapons being the most dramatic example. And these technologies, whether in artificial intelligence or information systems or biology, all create potential for unexpected effects, for accidents, for emergent effects, that is, things no one could predict, for interactive effects, and indeed they're liable to sabotage. If you think how we try and control civilian technologies to minimize those unintended consequences, it's striking that, for example, in our exploration of self-driving cars, we naturally insist on what will be 100 million miles or many tens of millions of miles of driving to encounter all unexpected kind of contingencies. And we debate what it means when one company or another has an accident. But in the military context, we can't anticipate in the same way. We can't do the equivalent of 100 million miles of driving in combat, because we don't have those combat situations involving high-end sophisticated adversaries, and we can't see how their systems will interact with ours, and this compounds and intensifies the risks. It's also the case that we, because of secrecy and the like, eliminate a lot of third-party review, and in fact have complications ourselves internally with silos of different technology operators, and some of the users will not gain access to special access program materials and the like until they're actually called upon to use them. So the risks are substantial. I just would underscore that the nature of those risks is particularly intense. When you look back at the history of our managing other technologies, and I give some examples in the paper, just two that I would highlight to you are the Castle Bravo nuclear test in 1954, where there was a calculation of the fallout range done by very smart analytic people, and those people conclude that the envelope of potential radiation dispersion is X. They go ahead with the test, and it turns out to be 3X, and some 600 people are exposed to radiation with lasting, lifelong effects. Another example that I offer in the paper is associated with the 1977 H1N1 influenza virus, where remarkably there's a quiet consensus amongst biologists, you can find traces of this in the literature, that there was a dissemination of that virus. The dissemination of that virus was probably caused by the escape of the virus from a government's freezer, probably a military-related thing, or possibly as a result of an open-air vaccine test that the Chinese conducted around that time. Either way, you have a worldwide pandemic, which, for reasons we can get into if it interests the panel and you all, pretty clearly doesn't arise from a natural cause, but rather from these interactions of technology. The paper lays out some recommendations about what to do about all this, and we can get into that in the discussion. So I'd like in the discussion to really highlight two aspects of this. One is diagnostic. Is this a right picture of the world? Should we be worried about this in the way that I described? And then the second is prescriptive. What is it that we ought to do about this? So our intent really is not to have presentation from these three very skilled experts, but really to have a discussion amongst the four of us. And I've encouraged this trio, and if you know this trio, you know they probably don't need much encouragement, to be critical as well as hopefully finding some things they like in this report. And we'll go back and forth between one another. We decided amongst ourselves that General Cartwright would start because he's the most courageous of the four of us. Jim.
I'm the knuckle dragger in this crowd. I think, this discussion is important to get at the front end as early into the game as possible, and it should probably be redone on multiple occasions as new technologies are introduced. I think for me, in the experience side of the equation, the one area that I think has to be explored a little more than probably was given opportunity in the paper, but risk is a continuum, and you operate on that continuum, and your audiences are in different places on it. Demographically, the people are in different places on that continuum of risk and what they're willing to tolerate, what they aren't. So for me, understanding where you are on that continuum adjusts what steps you take as you move forward and what steps you're willing to take and how much risk you're willing to take. For me, with a problem of somebody appeared on the flank of that unit and was able to take advantage of a position that we had, and we lost people, I'm willing to say to Valerie at DARPA, I'm willing to take the 20% right now. the 20% solution, untested, anything that will get me lives protected, even if it's not all of them, I'm willing to take that risk. If it's the approach of, should we introduce precision and stealth into the force, that's a very different calculus, and more in line with much of the decisions, particularly in processes laid out in this paper. And I think that's important to understand. The question is, in the first case, when you're willing to take the risk, then at what point do you intervene, and how do you continue to intervene as we move along to understand the risks that you've signed up to in urgency, and now how do they look in the light of day when you've got time to look at how they were practiced, how they were fielded, what effect they actually had, etc. And oftentimes we'll get down that road and re-wicker, but that continuum is important to me, I think, and you've got to understand it, and we've got to make sure that we have process for both ends of the continuum.
Recognizing that point, the paper argues that essentially these technologies have unpredictable aspects, that they're opaque and complex. Do you think that's right?
Yes, very much so. It's very difficult as you start down a path. You start down there generally on the military side of the equation anyway for a reason, for a desired outcome that you'd like to enhance or create. We can often start down those paths, and all of a sudden the outcome is maybe looks good, but the second and third order effects may look bad or may look even better. I'll go back to the stealth/precision. We started down that path with a sense of if we could put people in harm's way less often, have better management of collateral damage, and understand our targets better and the precision in the intelligence side of the equation, then our deterrence would be better, and our coercive effect of war and imposing will would be more effective. Much of that is true, but second and third order effects of it have been very interesting in a societal construct, number one, and an expectation construct. I'll never forget the first night of the second time we went into Iraq, of watching Baghdad. Bombing did not interrupt the rush hour. People just kept going. And traffic lights worked, everything.
Actually, if it had been Washington, everything interrupts.
Everything. But I mean, it has changed the thought process. But the second order effect was something that we never expected, really, which was a substantial reduction in the amount of men and equipment on the battlefield, because we didn't have to move 155 rounds forward in truckloads to keep up with the artillery. It just fundamentally changed the game. It changed the game on how much it took in the Iron Mountain, so to speak, to get forward. Those kinds of second and third order effects are beneficial here.
Right.
There are some that are equally non-beneficial, and you have to reassess.
Jeff, Valerie, what's evocative for you, or did you disagree with in this report?
So on this point of there's a continuum of risk. So currently the national security agencies are at one position on this risk continuum. There's diversity within them, but collectively they're around some value. And part of the reason that you're writing this is that you think that they ought to be someplace else, right? That the risks from accidents are being too highly discounted or just not considered at all, so they're discounted infinitely, right? In favor of immediate operational use or whatnot. So a question that I have, though, is very much like Jim just said, about where do we want to be, right? How will we know when we're done? How will we know when we're appropriately balanced, right? What will be the point at which you would be comfortable writing the counter to this, saying we're doing too much now, right? And I don't feel like we yet have a principled way of answering that question other than hearing which voices are yelling the loudest, right?
So let me disagree with both of you, actually. And Valerie, then we'll invite you in, hopefully on my side. But I don't really think that we do or should dial up risk across this continuum I'm closer to the Scott Sagan and Perot view of normal accidents that's referenced in the paper. And I think the implication of the emergent effects and other things is that we can't really calculate this terribly well. I don't think we can or should dramatically dial down risk or dial it up. I think what we ought to do is do a better job of recognizing it and preparing for it so that we can take certain steps that repress the likelihoods that we see or give us a better ability to respond, even in concert with our opponents, to inadvertent consequences. And I can say more about what I think, but do you want to have at that, Jeff, before Valerie gets in?
No, I suspect that Valerie will pick a side here right now, and so I'm interested to see.
Yeah. Valerie, you don't have to speak if you're going to agree with them and not me.
So when I read this, one of the first thoughts that came to mind was actually, I remembered the quote in the movie Jurassic Park that I don't remember it exactly, but your technologists were so busy worrying about whether they could, they never stopped to think about whether they should. And that's kind of a little bit about what this report is about. And so from that perspective, I wrestle with whether technologists are really the right people to, in and of themselves, be deciding how technology should be used. I think they can inform that discussion, but it needs a greater community that probably brings motivations beyond what technologists themselves really bring to the table in terms of trying to
I'm just
address.
wondering if it increases my faith in national security that DARPA is citing Jurassic Park. Jeff, let me just ask you in this. I'm sorry, Valerie, did you have more you wanted to say in that?
I do, but it'll come out in the course of the
I
conversation.
just wanted to ask you, Jeff, in this, in the last part of the paper, there's an appendix from in which I cite Jason Matheny's, I think, excellent questions that he provides now to IARPA program managers and directors like you, saying, think about these considerations before you embark on your project. Will it proliferate? How would we deal with others if it does? Will it have unintended consequences? How can we cushion that? Do these questions make any difference day to day?
Definitely, and I'm not just saying that because he's my boss, but I've seen instances both with myself and other program managers at IARPA and others in our extended family where having these questions brought to us leads us to different action. And it is often the case where technologists or scientists are thinking of what can be done and what can be built, and seeing the immediate first-order ramification of that for operational use, and then not considering the second and third-order effects. And just as soon as the question is asked, what are those larger effects, then things start to look different. One, more complex, but also that maybe it's not such a good idea to go down that route. So one of the questions is about how quickly would an adversary be able to replicate your capability once you build it, right? So they could build it completely on their own, but if you build it, how long until they get some of the benefit of your effort, right? And you could have adversaries that are nation states or terrorist groups. And the answer is almost always that it will help them, right? And so by building a capability, you are contributing to your adversaries having that capability, which you don't want, right? So we're having this race condition where we're trying to always be technologically superior is all well and good if you can always stay superior, but the fact that you are running faster also means that your adversaries can draft off you, and this is not desirable. So if you can find opportunities to build, say, defenses before the weapons, so that it doesn't matter if you or your adversary builds it, the new capability no longer matters, right? That leads to better game theory. That leads to more stable situations where you have more strategic stability, but also sort of breathing space in order to be able to now start to address technological actions, which is your main area.
Can you provide an example where somebody's, an entity second to the game has achieved an advantage?
I don't need them to be, by advantage you mean superior to us?
well, an
Or,
advantage.
I mean,
yeah.
the Cold War wasn't good, right? And the USSR having nuclear weapons was assisted by us having nuclear weapons, right? And I am not in a very controversial position where I think having these two superpowers pointing nukes at each other was not stable, right? Or desirable, perhaps a bit risky, right? So that's just one obtuse example,
But
right?
we were always in a position of technology superiority during that time.
Well, you think that DARPA is trying to think of the kind of defenses, Valerie, that Jeff was describing?
I do. I think there's
Car,
examples
planes, and water. Sorry.
in our portfolio, particularly in the context of AI, where we are anticipating these sorts of challenges and threats. Trust and autonomy, explainable AI, those sorts of programs are looking to address
Thank you.
the challenges of how we
I got quite a few things.
of how we might address unintended consequences. But our mission is to ensure we never have another Sputnik moment. So we are looking to see where the technology can go. We don't have the I guess the Matheny Catechism. We have the Heilmeyer Catechism at DARPA, which I guess you use as well too. But in the course of addressing these questions, what is the impact? The questions of unintended consequences in that dialogue do come up, and we do think about them. Maybe, arguably not as much as we could in some cases, but generally we do look to see, how might they be defeated? How might how might we be surprised? So we're always looking at where might the surprise come from.
The SafeGene project seems to me to be a good example of this. Maybe you want to spend a moment on that?
It's not in my office, but the idea is that gene editing has gotten out there. It's becoming a fairly democratized tool, and it's looking at both unintentional, something gets out into the environment. How do we know that there's a gene that has been edited, and how do we turn it off if it has, whether it's been intentional or unintentional? So they're looking at tools to help detect when that's happened and then to mitigate the
I'm also struck by the fact that the creators of Stuxnet created a termination date in it so that if it escaped into the wild, its effects would at least be limited. And SafeGene is an example of that in the context of some of the DNA work. We can program not only genetic changes using techniques like CRISPR and the like, but we can also make our new creation dependent on some supply of an ingredient that's not naturally available, so we can control it, or we can give it a termination date. So those strike me as examples of this kind of thing.
But you're never going to completely eliminate
Correct.
the surprises. If Stuxnet had a date, well, if your computer didn't have the right clock or your date time on it, then you were vulnerable.
So this is central to my view, and it comes back a little bit to what you said about Sputnik, and quite you correctly said, Valerie, about DARPA. We should never be surprised again. My view, and I've argued with generations of DARPA directors about this, is that's wrong. We are going to be surprised. It is the nature of technology now, and we should stop creating the illusion that it will be otherwise. And just as you said about the genes, we will be surprised by what happens. And this comes back to the fundamental comments that you offered, Jim, and you offered, Jeff, at the outset. My sense is the risk is there. We need to recognize it will always be there, no matter what we do. And the question is now, what do we do about it? And I'd like to come back to the prescriptive side of this, but if any of you want to say more about that before we turn to that.
I think there's one other piece to the risk, and that is really bringing it into the current day environment. And much of the challenge that we have when we deal with this, it's easy to look back and have a vision of where it all ended up and therefore backtrack your way into why it ended up there. That's one approach here. But most of the time, the challenge that we have is we're in an area where we do not understand the risk. We
Right.
can't apply standard metrics and observation to it because we don't understand it. And this world of complexity of the interaction of parts in the engineering we've done to date, at least on the military side, high reliability is done by wiring something in hard so that when you push a button, you know exactly what's going to happen at the other end. The world that we're entering into, where things are connected together, ideally to make them more effective, does not yield the same result every time you pull the button or push the button. You can see that in self-driving cars, you can see that in genetics, you can see that. The complexity is really being paced by computational power. And we're trying to straight line a forecast of the future and the downside risks against an unknown line here. We're just taking what we know and turning cyber into, you know, an existential risk. Maybe, maybe not. We don't know. And so the exploration piece of this, which takes time, introduction strategies, things that these guys are very good at, but this complexity issue, that the outcome is not the same for the same action that we're starting to enter into. So when you look at a learning algorithm, when you look at deep learning, if it takes a curve driving a car, that's a data point, one of millions, and it just keeps learning, and it'll never take that curve the same way because the background information is different every time. We just don't understand that stuff yet.
Sorry, Jeff, did you want to?
Go ahead.
I would just add that I think the 20th century mentality is not only obscures the point you're making, it's also that if we can assess these things, somehow we can do it at the beginning and have it.
Yeah.
And these systems evolve. Obviously, the biology systems evolve because evolution is a biological phenomenon. The artificial intelligence systems evolve because that's the nature of them, of their self-learning kind of capabilities. But it's not just them. Even if you take traditional digital technology, traditional as we've now come to understand it after 40 years of experience, 90% of what happens on a software system happens after the software is introduced. It's patched, it's modified, it interacts with other things. The Microsoft system has to interact with the Adobe system, etc. And so the net effect is that as those systems grow more complex and more interactive, they're used out there in the field. On Navy ships, we're constantly changing the system in a variety of ways. So one of the things that recent Navy accident reports observe is new people come on and the system has evolved in ways beyond their training. Yeah. So this points to the need for not just audit at the beginning and reflection at the beginning, but also continuously, and that's a different kind of challenge. Jeff, sorry.
So I absolutely agree with a lot of the risk isn't front-loaded. Some hefty percentage of it is back-loaded or appears in operation for all the reasons that you just said. And I'm also very sympathetic to the notion that the risks are really wild. They are very difficult to quantify or identify or whatnot. And so I'm very much in favor of being broad-minded when considering all the things that can go wrong. But when starts to bring in this concept of, oh, it's just undefinable risk, so it's infinite risk, and that's what it shakes out to mathematically, that leaves you in a tricky spot because you still have to act and you still have to choose between options. And in choosing between options, you are hopefully explicitly, but often implicitly, making judgments about relative risk, right? So if we're choosing to invest $100, $100 million, $100 billion towards addressing some category of risk, that means that we think that it is worth doing so and not spending that amount of money on something else with a more well-defined benefit, right? So we are, in fact, saying something implicitly about the quantitative structure of these risks. So saying that they're undefinable doesn't get us all the way to some operational reality. And this is not so terrible because, in fact, even with these wild risks, there are lots of things we know. So yes, the automated vehicle will drive around and could potentially do all sorts of things, but we know it's not going to sprout wings and fly off and try to
Not
save
so
the
sure.
citizen, right?
Yeah.
Right? We are actually have a lot of bounds on its behavior. And so I think it's the case that you use the analogy of maps somewhere in here, or if you didn't write it, then I thought it while reading. And so we have all this unforeseen terrain that we haven't explored yet, right? We have some detail about the terrain that we've been in, but not perfect detail. But we have all these areas of a vast continent of technology that we haven't explored yet. We don't know what's there. But we do know some things. If there's a mountain over there and I ask you what's on the other side of the mountain, you're not going to say a sun, right? There's not a star there. There's going to be some combination of dirt and water and air, right? And so you actually know a lot. And so if one recognizes that, that allows you to put bounds on the risks and now begin to make these statements.
So I largely agree with what you just said. One thing, though, that I observe that I think intensifies your point is, given the proliferation, the dispersion of science and the like, it is the case that this has a drive of its own. I think of modern technology as autocatalytic. It just contributes all these parts to each other. And so you not only have to decide for yourself what you're going to do, but you have to decide in light of the presumption that others will do lots of things. And you not only have to attend to the risks associated with us doing things, but also the risks of their doing things. So one of the more aggressive propositions prescriptively in the paper is we ought to substantially step up our talking with our opponents as well as our allies about these risks, try and sensitize them to them. And part of the planning process is trying to develop some robust mechanisms of contingency planning against events occurring. An example I use is if you had a pathogen that was highly infectious that broke out in some other country, we wouldn't be able to say, well, that's just their concern. This is obviously going to be ours. But we don't have joint planning around these kinds of things. We don't have the equivalent of the nuclear PAL circumstance where we lend controls, we educate other countries about how to control their weaponry. So what do you think of this? Is this pie in the sky, naive and impossible? Desirable? Both?
Yeah. In a standard taxonomy of policy to norms to regimes to law, new technology we tend to manage as long as we can for the unknowns down at policy, regimes, and norms. And it's in regimes and norms that you reach out to your allies and your adversaries through treaties and other venues to have conversation. I'll use as an example the New START Treaty. For all of its warts, the preamble talks about conventional that looks like strategic, defenses versus pure offense. I mean, it is a venue by which both sides can say to you, I'm looking in this area, and I'm giving you a heads up so that if you really don't like it, you can say something about it. We can talk about the attributes of that system at some point. We may listen to you, we may not, but at least we're going to have a conversation. And we may elect in norms and regimes to not go down that path at all, even though it may cede some perceived advantage to you. So, I mean, it's robust, but it's still voluntary, and it's difficult.
My problem, go ahead, Valerie.
Well, I was just going to say, you actually talk about the example of the biological weapons, right? Our decision not was viewed as a ruse by the former Soviet Union, so they upped their efforts in that area. So I would just I agree that we should be pursuing all potential paths towards awareness of unintended consequences and mitigation strategies for them. But I also think we need to understand, again, that just as technological superiority does not equal national security, neither does the development of treaties and agreements equate to that as well. I think the opioid crisis that we have today is an example of we have regulation, we had studies initially, and hundreds of people are dying per day in the U.S. from overdoses. So there's always going to be that unintended consequence or misuse, whether intentional or not, that it behooves us to be thinking about and not being too satisfied with any sort of arrangements we might be able to have in these discussions.
Jeff, do you want to comment on this?
Yeah, so I'm very much in the camp that there are opportunities through talking with allies and adversaries to create good game theory, right? To create better interactions with each other, that even if everyone is self-interested, we will yield a better situation. Now, the difficulty is that people may have desires or incentives to defect, and with some of these technologies, it can be very difficult to tell when they have. So you mentioned with regards to bioweapons in the USSR, and that involves detection and supply chains and whatnot, or also dual use. The proliferation of the technology in the commercial and private sector doesn't help, and so on. So some technologies are more amenable to this than others. But for the ones that are not so amenable, the strategy shouldn't be say, well, that's it, we're done. This is just a negative development for humanity, and we're just going to have to hope that we can live with it, because the alternative is that we don't, right? I say, no, we still in fact have agency here, and we can try to address these things with technology. So as a technologist, I look for those opportunities to differentially fund or develop technologies that will change this game, right? So at AARPA, we have programs relating to detecting whether or not an organism has been biologically engineered, and as this one small piece of a pipeline for making bioweapons more detectable and monitorable and whatnot, so that those treaties in regards to bioweapons can be more enforceable and thus lead to better outcomes, not just for the U.S., but for the world. So this is, I think, just one example of the places where the technologists can try to imagine what's over that mountain versus over that mountain and choose to go that way because they think it will lead to better dynamics.
So I just want to make two concluding points and then open this up to questions and comments from the floor. One is in General Cartwright's nice construction of how we move from technology innovation through norms to regimes and so forth. The problem, and I think I'm the only lawyer on this panel, the problem is that there's such a delay when our institutions of governance, both domestically and especially internationally, follow the technology innovation. They lag so much. And as we get technology acceleration, which we're all witnessing, I think, the importance of that delay, and as these technologies become more potent, becomes more and more troublesome. Maybe I can afford 25 years before society catches up or before the regime internationally gets there, if I'm dealing with a relatively controlled weapon where there are relatively few competitors. But when there very quickly are a large number of people this proliferates to, it worries me a lot more. And my problem as a lawyer is how laggard my profession is in this regard in developing this. The second thing I just want to note is a lot of what we do in pursuing technology superiority is justified, and I think several comments from the panel suggest this, on theories of deterrence. Well, this is risky, but it's a lot less risky than letting our opponents run ahead. We maintain superiority can deter undesirable acts. And I think that theory is time-tested and has power. But nobody thinks that deterrence substantially deters accidents and unintended effects. So the most potent rationale for advancement in the technology superiority race doesn't help us in the context of what I'm flagging here. And that's one of the reasons I think this is a particularly important topic. I do not want a world in which we cease to take risk or in which we don't pursue technology superiority. But I think our establishment very much underinvests for all kinds of reasons in worrying about the kind of thing that this discussion has been about and this report is about. You'll get a chance, I think, to say more. Let's just see if anyone from the audience wants particularly to either ask a question or make a comment. And you don't have to do the whole Washington thing of disguising your comment as a question. If you want to make a comment, just be brief. Paul, go ahead. And if you can identify yourself, since we have a television audience.
Sure. Stockton.
It's not me making these derogatory noises, Paul. I don't know where they come from.
It admits my comment.
Sorry, I think it is your mic. It started out.
Richard, your argument isn't fully anthropocentric. You're not worshiping the value of humans in the loop. In fact, you're a little bit caustic. And I was looking for recommendations at the end of the paper on what we should do maybe to get humans out of the loop in a constructive way, but you didn't quite go that far. I'm wondering what you would tell policymakers and those responsible for AI development initiatives now, how to keep humans from screwing things up.
Yeah. Well, I would say that there is a kind of deus ex machina in the present circumstance. There's this invocation of this figure from off the stage who will descend, and that is the human who will control the ultimate decision-making. And the Pentagon emphasis is constantly on, well, humans in the end are making these decisions. And I think it's overstated in its significance. There are circumstances where it matters. I like the fact that we are adding in situations where very grave action might be taken, a second variable, in this case a human being in addition to the machine. But it's different. The machine is typically digital, the human is analog in effect. I like that. It's a check on the system. But the reality is that most human decision makers are highly reliant on machine information, on sensor data, on algorithmic analysis that has led to conclusions about the flight trajectories of ballistic missiles, where they're coming from, where they're going to, and the like. And the human, given very little time, is in fact typically inclined to go along with the machine, or in some instances is as likely to add error of a different kind as it is to be, as the human is to be corrective. My view about this is we should stop putting so much emphasis on the human in the end and place much more emphasis on the kind of upfront analysis, cushioning, creation of consequence management activities and the like, because it's at the front end that most of our opportunities exist. But for some of the reasons we've talked about, I think the front end is undervalued. But
I want 2 seconds on that one. Again, looking forward, a lot harder than looking back. But I'm not sure we know in the AI construct where the human actually belongs, number one. Number two, I believe the paper was very good in stating that, up until now, we offered pattern recognition, we offered for a long time the ability to see something and identify it, those types of things. Much of of the 5 senses have been overtaken by other kinds of sensors that are more effective. I can see 30 miles out, at facial quality, instead of my own eyes, from an airplane seeing from maybe 3,000 or 4,000 feet. So things have changed. I don't know that we know exactly where it is, and I think that to think otherwise is to go against human nature in and of itself. If I ask anybody in this room to create an automated process of, putting your coat on in the morning, we do it just like we do it today now. We try to write a program for that, and then over time we do it. The machines would do it differently because we'd find different ways of doing it. We experienced this in fly-by-wire. I'll use that as an example, a classic example. Okay, that's the most dangerous thing in the world. We should never even think about going there, because if it's not metal connected to metal, I've lost control. So what did we do? We kind of told people that they were making the inputs. Okay, but it was 7 years before we told pilots that the stick was not connected to the flight controls. It just was too disruptive. Okay, now that's not necessarily a path to go down, but we didn't know where the person input piece, how we should describe it, because it wasn't the same as before. That's the key. And so we are in a path right now where we're doing the normal thing that we did with the Pony Express and then to the steam engine, to the car, etc. We're competing. You know, if we put Big Blue out and we win at chess, then we put Watson out and we win at Jeopardy. Okay, we're competing with the machine right now. We have not entered into that stage of partnership by a long shot. And we don't know what that looks like, quite frankly, because the competition helps us understand where we do good things. But I do agree with the paper that the potential here is that we offer diversity in how we make decisions, just by our own uniqueness and then by the uniqueness of machines. And how does that get implemented? You know, I'm not sure, but I think the last point I'd make on this is don't forget about the disruption that is caused by the people that are left behind. Our education system drops out at least one full generation, if not two, in any one of these transitions. And right now, we can't stand that. That's hugely debilitating to culture, to governance, structure, etc. And we've got to think more about how we do, your example of the ship, how we do make, when we have over-the-air transaction and change capability, how does the next crew understand how they should interact with that machine? Where's their learning come from? You know, our education process right now is dropping those generations out. We've got to figure out how to fix that.
I'd like to add on to that. You mentioned that we need to better understand what human on the loop really means and how we're using that phrase. And I'm going to say something somewhat contentious right now, so I want to make clear that it's me, not DARPA speaking. Anybody who's worked with me has heard me say that I think that machine learning is a misnomer. I don't believe that we have machines that learn. If they were really learning machines, they would be able to tell you when they are giving you a wrong answer. I believe we have machine-trained systems. We have, so the information that they give back to us is only as good as what we've either programmed them or trained them to do, and a function of the input data that we're asking them to evaluate. So the notion that these machines are at fault or somehow misleading us is in itself a misleading statement. They are as good as we have made them at this point. That's not to say that in the future we might not impart the equivalent of learning into machines and AI. We need to be able, in order to do that, they need to be able to do some sort of the equivalent of reasoning about whether the question that they are answering actually makes sense. Does it hold up? We know, you've all seen the examples of an image of a building, and there's some noise that's added to that, and now the machine says it's an ostrich. Well, we can look at that, and we know from experience that it's still a building, even though some minor things have changed. We're not past that point yet. So human on the loop, human in the loop can be point-wise, but there's humans in the loop through the whole process right now because we are the ones that are training and programming these machines at this point.
Let's let another question in, and then Jeff, I think you probably have things to say on this. Go ahead.
So what do you see the appropriate role of the private sector being in establishing these norms in the new paradigm?
So I have views on this, but if one of you would like to comment.
I have.
Go ahead, Doug.
So certainly the industry is advancing the technology, but there are differences in the acceptable performance because the consequences of a machine making a mistake in deciding what advertisement you're going to see when you go onto Google are different from the consequences of a mistake when you're trying to do target recognition, that sort of thing. So there's certainly a role in advancing the technology, but you can't carry the full burden. It's got to be in a partnership with the DoD and the National Security Enterprise.
I think we're all seeing this shift of more and more R&D being done by the private sector. In the 1950s world, government dominates the R&D scene. now it's twice as much R&D by some measures being done in the private sector as in the government. The companies have obviously market incentives, many of them global market incentives, that abet the proliferation of these technologies, whether they want to participate in military matters or not. So the companies clearly have a significant role to play. I think it's an important question for the U.S. to figure out. It's rather clear that companies in more authoritarian states are heavily influenced, sometimes cat's paws, for the maneuverings of those states. In the United States, it's quite a different milieu. Some companies are very sympathetic to and cooperative with the national security mission, and others aggressively reject it. We need to sort that out more, and we haven't figured that out. At the moment, it's a complication for us that doesn't exist, I think, in anything like the same form for authoritarian states. There's a whole other big topic of importance.
I would just add, at least from my perspective, going to the private sector, particularly small business and private labs, things like that, the risk calculus is a lot higher. In other words, they're willing to take a lot more risk and they're willing to fail, which is unique to this country. And so it's not, kind of a one-size-fits-all. And I tend to look more towards FFRDCs, DARPA, and whatnot to look at that risk and say, is there a there in those early stages? Should I follow it and chase it? And then they're very good at incremental improvement. And just the basic process of incremental improvement is much better in the private sector than it is really in the military sector because they keep doing it. It's their way to survive.
I think we should call on someone from the back rows. Who's furthest back? I can't see you, but in the lights there. Yeah, go ahead.
My name is Tony Spadero. I have a question. How address the issue of a new technology that we invest in with the secondary effect of an adversary using that to catch up?
What about the other way around?
Now, on the hypothetical that we have a foreign entity that is at risk to us with a new innovative technology that we did not get to, do we have the decision structures and the agility to play catch up and perhaps become superior?
I would argue that we do. We have demonstrated that historically. Will we be successful at it is another question. But the opportunities, particularly in at least the military side of the equation, to have units, special, urgent need type. I was flanked. I don't know why I was flanked. I've been outmaneuvered here. He goes faster than I do, jumps higher, whatever it is. What am I going to do about it? I've got a place right away, certainly in my experience in the military, that I point immediately. Get those guys on this. Why did that happen? What do we have to do? If it's a big breakout, then there are a lot of soft power type things that you can do to manage it. But we should not think of that as an aberration. That should really be in the norm of thought.
So to address that question, but combine it with the previous question with regards to the private sector. So we're we're in a very global economy, right? And we've already heard that the bulk of R&D happening, particularly with regards to applications of defense relevance, is happening in the private sector. And so I would struggle to see it happening very often, that there would be a breakout or a big advance of some kind happening in another country that wouldn't quickly spill out over to other countries, including ourselves. That is, in fact, part of my concern about us developing certain things, right? So if I get to be concerned about the one thing, it seems like I don't have to be concerned about the other so much, right? So it's pick your poison.
We're coming up against our deadline, but let's squeeze in one more question. Yeah.
David Heyman, observation that in your prescriptive part of the report, there's an emphasis on some processes and policies that would be helpful, and a recognition that we can't control, that we actually have to deal with potential consequences. And it seems to me that we might adhere or adapt or embrace some of the private sector learning in a complex, emergent, global, innovative society, and that is agility. And the agility of systems depends upon the agility of people. And to the general's point, it seems a recommendation on investment on the human capital side, because we won't be able to predict the technology. But if we have the agility to adapt with the people, that we may be in a better position. I would offer that.
Yep. So I have a comment on that, but if any of you would like to say anything?
I think it's very clear in our 2018 National Defense Strategy that agility is very much placed at a premium, and an emphasis on delivering performance at the speed of relevance. And so a big part of the strategy addresses making sure that we're leveraging manpower in the appropriate way to achieve that.
Just as a small comment, I don't know that I have been in any form of public meeting with regards to technology and what the U.S. government should do that did not state at some point that the U.S. government should be faster and more agile. Now, the issue is, how do you actually do that, right? And so there's the comment that people power is part of it, and that's absolutely true. But another part is bureaucratic flexibility and whatnot. And so there are a multitude of reasons why the private sector is more flexible than government, and part of that is they're able to smash things and build up new stuff much quicker than we are.
Yeah, I would just add, I think there are a number of very concrete things that we need to do. For example, on the personnel side, which you, David, rightly point to, I think, is really important. The amount of wastage associated with our uniformed services in terms of people of exceptional talent, particularly technical talent, who do not see potential careers that are nearly as gratifying for them in the military, is a serious concern from our standpoint. The system does not account for these requirements of agility. For example, if you're a Navy enlisted man or woman with technical skills, you can rise up to the middle ranks, E4 through 6, pursuing a technical career. But if you want to rise beyond that, there is no technical path you can follow and maintain that. If you're a young officer who has particular skills associated with information systems and the like, we have developed some communities now that give you some shot at promotion. But still, the likelihood that you will ultimately assume central roles responsible for budget, policy, and operations and the like is much lower than if you were unrestricted line, because now you're restricted line. And the examples of that kind continue. So I think we need to stop being simply rhetorical, as the question implies, and be much more operational in this regard. And on the acquisition side, if, for example, we said an implication of this technology diffusion and the speed of technological change is such that we don't give full value to, for example, a major ship, a carrier, that has a 30-year lifetime, or some ships that have 40-year lifetimes. We will discount the value 30 or 40 years out from now because of this change. And we will insist on your buying platforms with shorter lifetimes that are cheaper and that will change, or that you build agility in. Then you would begin to reform that system even with the bureaucratic thing. And I could go on, but I would get in a lot of trouble, because not only for what I'd say, but also because we're overrunning our time. I want particularly to thank the panelists. It's generous of you to come and do this. Center for New American Security, especially, an open philanthropy project, funded this work, and wouldn't have happened without them. So to the extent it produces anything good, they should be recognized. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.